everyone, and welcome to another episode of Neo Kobe Pizza, the only video gaming podcast that floats in soup. My name is Mark B, and joining me today is longtime GVN and diehard game fan, owner, operator, contributor, blah, 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 etc., so on, depending upon what we're talking about, Mr. Robert Fight Club Hubs. How you doing today, sir?
Doing wonderful. How you doing today, Mark?
I'm doing splendiferous.
Some things never change.
Pretty much. So, alright, let's start from the beginning here. When I originally brought up the idea of doing the podcast, the first idea that you came up with was the one that we're going with for today's topic, which was kind of discussing Sega RPGs throughout the years and why they've never really caught on. Where did that come from?
I think it's because you've been a big fan of the Phantasy Star franchise, and you've mentioned it many times about Phantasy Star 4, and I'm like, there's not many people I've talked to that are such big fans of the Phantasy Star genre, or Sega RPGs in general. I mean, this also came to a head, when we were talking about, when we were having our little Final Fantasy debate back on one of our GVN live shows. So I decided, you know what, I really want to know what's going on.
Okay, that's fair. So, is it fair to say that you were not necessarily as exposed to the Phantasy Star or other Sega RPG franchises growing up? Like, were they part of your formative years, or did you get into them after the fact?
I got into them after the fact. In fact, my first Phantasy Star game was 3, but I borrowed it off of a friend for like a little bit, but that wasn't until like around like 96, 97. My first hardcore Phantasy Star experience was the online version of Phantasy Star Online.
Okay.
On the Dreamcast.
Okay, that's fair. So it's those games were mostly things that you experienced after the fact. That was kind of a thing that passed you by. I'm guessing you were more of a Square or more of a Enix type person as you were growing up, maybe.
Yeah, actually, absolutely, I was. I was actually really a big fan of the Final Fantasies. 4 and 6 at the time were my favorites. 7 was a great game at the time when I played it. When it worked properly on my PC, because I didn't have a PlayStation at the time. So driver issues aside, I really enjoyed that. The Dragon Warrior games I got into on the NES. They were great. I played Ultima. I played pretty much anything that wasn't Sega related because, yeah.
You just didn't really have it available to you until later.
It was not readily available. In fact, I think it also might have been because when I did have a Genesis, my dad weaned away from maybe the more expensive games, and if I recall, Phantasy Star 4 was one of the most expensive games when it came out initially.
Yeah, I want to say it was either $60 or $70 when it launched.
I heard it was like around $90, but yeah, you might be more accurate.
Well, I bought it a few months after the fact. Like, I had gotten my own part-time job and saved up to get it, so I don't 100% remember, but I remember that it was roughly around that price point. Maybe it had come down in price, I don't know.
Possibly.
Alright, so that being the case then, this is going to be kind of an interesting discussion. What I'm going to try to do here, that being the case, is fill in the backstory of sorts as we go along. Mm-hmm. So that, since you didn't necessarily grow up with these games, but you did experience a lot of them, we can kind of fill in the blanks as to what was going on at that point. I can talk about things from, this is what was going on Sega's side of things, and you can talk about it from, this is what was going on the other side of things, so we can try to establish a timeline.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So the first thing to discuss here is that Sega has been making JRPGs pretty much as long as they've been making game consoles. When they started with the Sega Master System in the third console generation, they immediately got to work and released their very first JRPG there, and just kept at that all the way up until the 8th console generation today. And they have a really large, robust library of games. Like, that can't be understated here. Just going within the parameters that we're going to be discussing, there are close to 20 to 30 games that we can go over across multiple different platforms.
Yep.
That's a lot. That's almost some Square Enix numbers at this point. And yet, for some reason, despite the fact that they've been releasing JRPGs in various capacities over multiple different console generations, none of them have really gotten anywhere. Like, the biggest success story they had was Valkyria Chronicles in the PlayStation 3 era, because that did 1 million units, which was like a big deal. That was through grassroots campaigning, the whole bit. a million units.
That's like
Was
the biggest selling RPG of theirs, isn't it?
probably, yes. And it's really weird because they've made so many that have been critically acclaimed, that have been beloved by gamers who have experienced them. So it kind of comes down to the question of why, for all of the effort that Sega's put in, have none of their RPG franchises over 6 console generations caught on with gamers?
And that is a very good question, and I think there's maybe a few possible answers to this, and it could be a combination of these answers as well, depending on the time of or era of the Sega we're talking about. Like for the Genesis era of Sega, it could very well be that they didn't really market their RPGs as well. Whereas you could say that they tried their damnedest when they had the Dreamcast out. They were trying to market what they could.
That's definitely true. I feel like what we can do here in this case is kind of look back on things,
Mm-hmm.
review the release schedules from, again, the Sega side of things, which I will address, and then the other side of things, which I can kind of flesh out a little bit, or I'm sorry, bring up, and then you can flesh out as needed since you grew up with that more so than I did. And then from there, I think maybe we can kind of derive a few patterns based
Mm-hmm.
on looking back on all of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I do have a good perspective. I mean, you have more of a perspective on, like, let's say, the Phantasy Star and Shining games, but those are probably the only RPGs I never really experienced at the time that they, debuted. I've definitely experienced everything like Dreamcast and after.
Fair enough. The one caveat I do want to introduce here before we get started is that when we're talking about these games, specifically what we're going to be talking about here is the JRPGs and the strategy RPGs. While I do love me some Sega action adventure RPG games like, Beyond Oasis or Landstalker or Dark Savior or whatever.
Golden Axe Warrior.
Yeah, that was actually pretty okay, even if it was a bit of a Zelda ripoff. The thing is that if we start getting into those, we are literally going to be here all day. I don't have that kind of time, and frankly speaking, there just isn't really a lot to say about a lot of those games. They either kind of borrowed from other companies to a certain extent, or were
They
just
just
released.
didn't work.
Yeah, they were just released at a period where they weren't necessarily going to get over with people. So it's I do love those games, don't get me wrong. I think that they're fantastic. They just fall outside of the scope of what would be effective to discuss here. So when you're listening, keep that in mind. Now, we're going to have to start from the beginning, which is going to be the third console cycle. Nintendo had just released the NES a couple of years prior, and Sega had decided to jump onto the bandwagon with the Sega Master System. And while JRPGs were kind of a big deal in Japan and to a certain extent in Europe, in the US, they didn't really pick up particularly well at all. But Sega took the opportunity to try and bring out 2 games, although one of them was technically borrowed from another company, so we're not going to be counting it, which was Miracle Warrior Seal of the Dark Lord. I'm also not going to count it because that game is fucking terrible. Holy shit. I fucking hate that game. Oh my god. But Sega took the opportunity to bring out 2 games in the JRPG category, as well as a couple of action RPGs of varying degrees of quality. The one game in particular that most people will remember and talk about when it comes to Sega's JRPGs of that time period, of course, is the original Phantasy Star. For its time, Phantasy Star was phenomenal. It was easily the best-looking JRPG to come out at that console cycle. The audio was fantastic. The story was surprisingly, I don't want to say robust, just because there were a lot of instances where it fell into the same trap that most of your third and fourth console generation RPGs fell into, of little plot development over long periods of time. But it was pretty involved when I first played it.
One of the first RPGs to actually have cutscenes of dialogue.
Yeah, exactly. That's another big point. The cutscenes weren't exactly animated or particularly involved. It was just, talking head pictures over some text, but they were really neat, and it was not a thing that you saw, particularly if you were cycling back and forth between the NES and the Genesis. Oh, sorry, the NES and the Master System, because while NES games often had decently high quality stories, games like Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy did not feature those sorts of things. It was an amazing looking game. It was a game that held up surprisingly well, even outside of its console generation, and it basically made like no fucking money. Meanwhile, over on the NES side of things, there were two major games that came out. Dragon Warrior, which inspired a craze that lasted years, and Final Fantasy, which was a game that Squaresoft originally released as a swan song for their company and made so much fucking money that it saved the entire damn company. Well, you would have spent more time with those than I did, Robert. What are your thoughts?
Well, my first RPG ever, believe it or not, was Dragon Warrior. I actually came home one day and, it was kind of a surprise. My mom picked the game up from a pawn shop. However, my second RPG was Ultima Exodus. And needless to say, let's just say that I'm glad I played Final Fantasy next, because Ultima Exodus was almost the game that turned me away from RPGs.
Wow.
But I was not a big fan of that, although I hear the PC version was better. But regardless, Dragon Warrior was amazing in many aspects, because I was really drawn into the tactics of, like, casting spells, fighting dragons. I mean, this is my 10-year-old mind going nuts here, like, oh my goodness, I'm finally, fighting a dragon that looks like a dragon and not some really horrendous sprite that has these limited frames of animation, even though they were still images. You had a whole vast world to explore that felt bigger than, the original Legend of Zelda. Phantasy Star, or Final Fantasy, was originally, just this amazing game, too, that just completely caught me off guard, because, I mean, you look at still images of this and I'm like, okay, what's so impressive about this? Dragon Warrior at least had backgrounds during their battles. But then you go into this and you're like, oh, hey, check it out. The hero sprites are actually animated to some degree, and it got nifty sound effects. You got a very robust world to explore, lots of secrets to uncover, and all that stuff. And it was just really blowing my mind. It's also easily to say one of the best-looking games on the system to date. At the time, of course. I'm trying to remember, when did it come out? 89, 90?
Something like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, after that, I mean, Dragon Warrior 2, 3, and 4, I mean, every one of those games that kept coming out on the system is just like vast improvement one over the other. Like right away, when you start off with Dragon Warrior 2, it starts off with an introductory story. The castle's being invaded, the princess is kidnapped, the king was killed, a lone soldier manages to escape all the way to a faraway kingdom to find a hero to save the day. It was pretty good, in my opinion, and the scope of the stories just kept expanding. Dragon Warrior 4, being the biggest cartridge ever developed for the NES at the time, was just a very massive game that they split it up into chapters too, which was I guess was a brilliant idea on their part. I never really exactly finished the game, but it was just, in scope and size, it was just very impressive. The graphics were constantly improving as well, even though all the sprites were about the same and whatnot.
And Dragon Warrior really took off as a franchise to the point where there was all kinds of really ridiculous and weird, especially in Japan, reactions to it. Like, maybe in the US it wasn't necessarily as big of a deal. I mean, they had to give it away with Nintendo Power for free at one point to get people to be like, hey, let me take this game and see what I can do with it. But in Japan, there were all kinds of crazy reactions to it. While some of them are basically just kind of like little white lies or over exaggerations that have gone through the industry over the years, the very real reality is the series as a whole did take off in a way that a lot of people didn't expect.
Yeah, one of those weird things that I heard about, and I don't know if there's still any validity to it, but I heard that Dragon Warrior literally caused the entire government, Japanese government, to issue a law saying that game releases, especially Dragon Warrior releases, cannot happen during the weekday. They have to be on a weekend because of how massive of a release the games cause, or how massive the crowds are when they come to buy the game.
I believe that might be a bit of an over-exaggeration.
Possibly, yeah.
I know that they were releasing them on weekends.
Yeah, I think they said, like, Dragon Warrior 7 was released on, like, a Tuesday, and they said productivity of the entire nation, like, went downhill or something like that. I don't know how much belief there is in that, but...
Yeah, they had actually had hearings about it in the Japanese Diet, which is equivalent to like a parliament or a Congress, but they didn't really pass any laws about it, I don't think, because of the fact that there were all of those government discussions about it. However, it was ultimately decided internally to Enix and then later Square Enix to release the games exclusively on Saturdays, which I believe continued all the way until Dragon Quest 9 or 10.
Yeah.
But there was never a point where they actually passed a law forbidding it or anything like that. It was just a thing that happened to come up that way, and people kind of took it as, oh yeah, there's a law prohibiting them from doing it, or whatever the heck.
I guess they were just strongly encouraged to release on the weekend.
I don't even know if it might have been entirely their own decision. They might have been encouraged to do it so that they didn't have to put a law on the record saying Dragon Warrior games can only be released on the weekend, because how fucking weird of a law would that be? But yeah, it's not, there was definitely some do this please or whatever going on with that. This was a trend that kind of continued to the fourth console generation. While Dragon Warrior releases slowed down a bit, SNES RPGs continued to kind of have a bit more hype behind them. So Sega made the active effort to dramatically redouble their production in JRPGs across the board. I mean, make no mistake about it, the Sega Master System saw one major release from Japanese RPGs, one major release of a internally developed but licensed out from somebody else RPG, and a couple of action RPGs. The Genesis saw an extensive volume of RPGs, to the point where Nintendo basically needed to have Square Enix as well as themselves working to get to a point where they were competing in Japan or in the US. Sega had no less than 3 different entries in the Phantasy Star franchise come out during this console cycle in 2, 3, and 4, as well as the very first Shining game called Shining in the Darkness, which was a dungeon crawling sort of JRPG, and 2 different entries in the Shining Force series, which were overhead turn-based strategy RPGs.
I would technically say 4, because there was at least 2 released on the Game Gear on
I was not close to done.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. They also released a couple of weird side story Phantasy Star games for the Game Gear, like adventure games of sorts. They don't really fall into this particular conversation, but it's worth mentioning that they existed. They did also release 2 different games on the Game Gear, which were ultimately combined into one big JRPG called Shining Force CD on the Sega CD.
I got that game. It's wonderful.
It is. It really is. And on top of that, you also have what the various and sundry action RPGs, which again fall outside of the scope of this, but very much existed and very much were a part of Sega's library in various capacities. This was also the point where Working Designs was actively releasing games in the US on Sega's consoles, kind of sort of working as the closest thing that Sega would have had to a trusted developer, with games like Lunar and Lunar Eternal Blue. And then, of course, there's the game that generally a lot of people don't really remember, but it's nonetheless very important, in Dark Wizard, which was a surprisingly solid piece of work that unfortunately never really saw any kind of a follow-up or a sequel or anything, but it was honestly a really damn good game.
Yeah, I actually, outside of Popful Mail, which is considered the Working Designs holy trinity, I guess, even though it's like 4 games, Dark Wizard is probably a really underrated game that I'm surprised just didn't get as much fanfare. In fact, if I look back at some of the reviews that I saw, not a whole lot of people were really big fans of it, but I think now, as time has passed, it's definitely gotten a lot more praise for the type of chances they took with that game.
Yeah, and we don't really see it re-released in any capacity either, which is very strange and a little disappointing. But it was for its time, and even now, like, it's still a pretty good piece of work. It's not the easiest game to get into, which I completely understand, but it's a very ambitious piece of work, and it was honestly really damn good.
Oh yeah. I actually have to say one of my favorite elements of the fact is that like other later RPGs that were developed by Sega, like Dragon Force, took ideas from Dark Wizard, like being able to like create troops and stuff like that, and dispersing them to like towns and whatnot to get their health replenished and all that.
Yeah, and like I like Dragon Force better than Dark Wizard pound for pound,
Of course.
but it also wasn't successful. So, it's kind of a case of, well, both of these games were great, but nobody paid any money for either of them, so fuck it, whatever. But it's the thing is that Sega was on a roll, a really, really big roll with JRPGs during this time period. They released more JRPGs for the Genesis, the Sega CD, the Game Gear than they released for any other platform at any other point in time. Like the fourth console generation was a JRPG renaissance for Sega almost exclusively. And while later generations would see JRPGs hit a renaissance period on other platforms, make no mistake, if you loved JRPGs, the Genesis was where to be.
Oh, absolutely.
And unfortunately, that didn't really translate to great sales for Sega, as while the games made enough money to continue to be just profitable enough that Sega would want to keep making them, the games didn't actually end up being profitable enough that you would look at them and say, oh, these games were a huge rip-roaring success.
Yeah, some of that has to do with the fact that it's the way Sega marketed the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive in general. It was the arcade machine. It was the action machine. It was the machine for, the cool kids to play and all that stuff. It's the game where you want to play your sports games like Madden that came out and just got popular. It's the game that has blast processing with the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. It's got, Streets of Rage trilogy, it was seen as the cool system. And when you how do you promote an RPG, a JRPG, or a strategy RPG in the midst of that kind of a campaign?
To be fair, I can completely see where you're coming from, but you would think to a certain extent with the amount of raw popularity that the Genesis had that there would have been some room for people to jump in and invest that money, because it's not like Sega was losing for the entire console cycle. We know the numbers now, and Sega did indeed lose the fourth console generation, but it was very close. And for a number of years, Sega was straight up winning. You would think at some point during that process that winning the console war would have translated to a better investment in these games, but even though the RPGs that came out on Nintendo's consoles didn't sell particularly well, they sold better than fucking Sega's RPGs.
Yes.
And it's just very strange, even with that kind of reputation, that Sega did market these games, Sega did push these games, and people just didn't invest in them to the same extent.
I also think it has to do with the fact that it depends on who was making the games. By the Super Nintendo and Genesis fourth console generation era, people already knew who Square Enix and Square and Enix was. Whereas you come on to the Sega Genesis, you're like, wait, Sega also makes these type of games, and I guess it's kind of hard for some people who are buying into the Genesis for the action games, want to maybe move into the RPG genre, whereas people who got the Super Nintendo most likely was like, okay, hey, I remember these developers. They got some really cool looking games. Hey, look, Enix released one of their first RPGs, which was Seventh Saga. That game is freaking hardcore. Then you got Square, who came out with Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy II in the US, and Final Fantasy III, and Mystic Quest, and a couple of other games as well, like Mario RPG. So you have these established, trusted companies making games on one platform, and people aren't so sure about Sega making these RPGs because all they had at that time was Phantasy Star on the Master System.
And I can kind of agree with that to a point, especially during the early days of the console cycle. But I mean, look at it from the alternative perspective. By the time the console cycle was coming to an end, you've got Sega having made these games for years at this point, and reviewers have said Phantasy Star 2 is great, Shining Force is great, Shining in the Darkness is great, Shining Force 2 is great, blah blah blah, whatever. You've got that certain amount of, well, okay, these are probably games that I can trust. Whereas I like Enix and I like Squaresoft, I don't really think people were beating down the door to buy fucking ActRaiser. You know what I'm saying?
No.
And it's definitely not Seventh Saga. Seventh Saga is, even if you like Enix games, kind of widely regarded as a piece of shit.
I beg to differ, but, thank God for opinions.
No, I mean, like, not in terms of its aesthetics or in terms of its mechanics, in terms of the fact that the game was technically broken and requires an extensive amount of fucking grinding to get to a point where you even have a hope in hell of succeeding.
Well, okay, then that, yes, I can definitely agree to.
Right, like, it's not like a terrible game. I don't hate it. I think it's a good game. But in a lot of respects, it's a piece of shit because they've released it broken. And for those who came into gaming around, the 7th console generation where you had internet connectivity and people would patch these games to fix them, we didn't have that shit growing up. If a game came out and it was broken, fuck you. You played it, or you hoped that they would do some kind of a voluntary recall, which they rarely, if ever, did, and you just dealt with it. You just dealt with it. If you bought that game and it was broken or fucked up, oh well, sucks to be you. And like when I was a kid growing up, I got a decent amount of games because, I was an only child and video games were my babysitter. But for a lot of kids, it was, I get 4 games a year, maybe. And if this game that I ask for is fucked up, well, I'm beat because they're never going to fix it.
Yep.
But it is worth noting that Sega's big legacy coming out of the 4th console generation, 2 games. Phantasy Star 4, Shining Force 2. And which I personally love Shining CD better, but Shining Force 2 is their legacy title. It is the game that they made that is the standard bearer for the Shining series by and large. On the other hand, Nintendo ended up walking away with 3 legacy titles to variable degrees. Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG. And yeah, all of those are Square titles in the US.
But that's also not counting, other franchises that debuted, like the Breath of Fire series brought on by Capcom.
Yeah, but Breath of Fire was always kind of I don't even want to say like a tertiary franchise because it was never really a focal point for Capcom, and it was never really a franchise that was making Capcom the kind of money that Street Fighter or Mega Man were making them.
But they still continued to make them because, surprisingly, it ended up being a hit.
It ended up being a hit to a point, but it wasn't, like, nobody talks about, very few people, put it this way, talk about the Breath of Fire series in the same conversation as Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior or even Phantasy Star. Like, it's at the time that Breath of Fire was out, pound for pound, it was still a notable franchise, but it was kind of your lowest tier franchise, I would think.
For a low tier, though, but I would still say that back in the day, like in the early 90s, mid-90s, it was still a franchise that was even talked about in the same breath of, SNES RPGs, whereas nowadays it's really not really talked about, but, I mean, we're also talking about Capcom back in the day, whereas if a franchise wasn't popular like Mega Man or Mega Man X was, they practically dropped the games. Like, Bionic Commando was memorable, but, I don't think it sold that well, and they never made a sequel. In fact, it took them over 20 years before they finally made one?
Well, a remake first, and then a sequel, which,
yeah,
technically speaking, once again kind of killed the franchise for a few years. But, yeah, Capcom was definitely not somebody to invest in those kinds of games unless they were making them some money. I just feel like, again, it was not a franchise that was making the big dollars. And I feel like it in a lot of cases, Breath of Fire is one of those franchises that everybody who played JRPGs at that point remembers, but it's not a franchise that lived outside of the PlayStation 2 era. And the game that they released in the PlayStation 2 era was not the best that it could be. Like, it's definitely a franchise that's worthy of a certain degree of consideration, but like, in a lot of respects, those games were overshadowed by the standard bearers. And the standard bearers are the things that are consistently getting re-released and that we're consistently talking about. But it's like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger are the games everybody loves. Even in that same conversation, not as many people say like, hey, Phantasy Star 4 was really great. I loved that game. Even though Sega still had that kind of close to even footing with the SNES for several years.
Yeah, the Super Nintendo, even though I heard it pretty much was a 2-to-1 margin near the end of the 4th console cycle. Or is it the 5th? I forget.
That one's the 4th console cycle, and I wouldn't say it's a 2-to-1 margin. I believe the numbers are like 38,000 to 45,000. No, million. But it's like 38 million to 45 million, which is
That's kind of different from the numbers I read, because the numbers I read, which was like a few years ago, and I actually did look up updated figures, and it's perplexed me. The figures were like 48 million Super Nintendos to like 22 million Sega Genesis Mega Drives, and then now it seems like an additional 20 million was somehow like added to that sales list since the last time I looked at it.
yeah. I don't feel like I don't feel like Sega was trying to sweeten the numbers or whatever, because at this point you still can't change the fact that you lost. But going in and looking at the Wikipedia pages just right now for reference, which I know, Wikipedia, but fuck you. You tell me where I can find any better data across the world. Super Nintendo had 49.1 million, so rounded up to 50. Sega ended up at 30.75, not counting the extras, so it's 50 to 30, which is not quite 2 to 1. Like that would be like 60 to 30, but it's like 1.6, 1.75, something in that neighborhood. So it's not an unrespectable showing by any stretch of the imagination. It's definitely positive, but for a while there, Sega was still pretty damn competitive up until, like, I'd say the past like the last 2 or 3 years. Sega was pretty competitive and was definitely the standard bearer in the U.S. for a while for reasons outside.
And then they
of
went
JRPGs.
add-on crazy.
Yeah, that's a completely different conversation. But no, yeah, Sega completely fucked themselves on that one, which is what it is.
And then they totally screwed themselves thanks to the guy in charge of Sega during the Saturn years.
Yeah, that's an entirely different conversation, unfortunately.
Well, it's sort of relatable. So, like, when you want to get to the next generation of consoles, I could definitely elaborate.
Well, let's just go on to that at this point, actually. Fifth console generation is honestly kind of a low period for Sega JRPGs. Sega basically retired the Phantasy Star franchise outside of a collection that they released. And while they did release several entries in the Shining series, including 3 different entries in the Shining Force 3 catalog, only one of which made it to the US, and Shining the Holy Ark, which went back to Shining in the Darkness's roots of being a first-person dungeon crawler. That was pretty much it from Sega. We got
Panzer Dragoon Saga.
well, I'm talking about like JRPGs, but yeah,
Well,
we got.
if that's still technically like a JRPG, it's still turn-based.
You could make an argument in both directions. Panzer Dragoon Saga is probably the closest that we're going to get outside of that. Sega also had that weird action Magic Knight Rare title, and Dragon Force, which was brought over by Working Designs but developed by Sega, which kind of sort of Dark Wizard-ish, but didn't really fit into any one category. The closest we could get to was strategy RPG, but it had more in common with something like an ogre battle than anything else, which is fine. It was still a great game. It just it kind of straddles a couple of different genres. It qualifies for the purposes of what we're discussing here, but it was a very odd game. Outside of that, though, we didn't really see a lot of Sega games that were true JRPGs in the strictest sense of things. Again, there was also Albert Odyssey, which was more action-oriented, and the Rare Earth title, which was action-oriented, both of which came from Working Designs. Until midway through the console cycle, they jumped over to Sony and took the Lunar titles that had been released for the Saturn and ported them to the PlayStation.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at the Japanese library of the Saturn, there was a ton of traditional JRPGs that never made it over to the US. Like Suikoden never made it over. Grandia never made it over. The Lunar games.
No, Grandia did make it over. The first one did.
Well, it made it over for the PlayStation, but not for the Sega Saturn.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, and then there's a few other RPGs, like the Sakura Wars franchise debuted on the Saturn, the first 2 games, and they were never brought over.
Yeah, and I feel like had Working Designs kept with Sega, had there not been the big falling out between Sega US and Working Designs, the Sakura Taisen titles probably would have made it to the US, and Grandia probably would have made it to the US as well.
Yeah, and it's all because of one man, Bernie Stoller. And he had this thing, for whatever reason, he said RPGs will never be a big system seller in the United States. He was proven wrong on the PlayStation. And then when he was fired from Sony and went to Sega, he carried his really, really bullish ways with him. And it doomed pretty much, I mean, outside of the fact that it was Sega Japan's idea to do the surprise launch of the Saturn, his unwillingness to experiment by bringing over these popular games that are in Japan, like the Sakura War games or the other Shining Force games, it pretty much helped sink the boat for the Sega Saturn in the US. Because it sold well for a while in Japan, the Saturn. It did not sell well at all in America.
Yeah, and it also really doesn't help that they got into a big argument with Working Designs because of Stolar's bullshit, because he wasn't particularly interested in the idea of working with them, to the point where there was just a lot of bad blood. He didn't want to work with Working Designs on the Sony side of things, which is probably why they stuck with Sega for as long as they did during the fifth console generation. But there was also a sense of loyalty from Vic Ireland, as I understand it.
Oh, yeah.
And when Stolar came over and just like, well, fuck you guys, it was very passive aggressive. Like, Working Designs had been a really reliable partner for Sega for a number of years, and he would just kind of treat them poorly. Like, when they would do trade shows together, Working Designs would be positioned really far away from Sega's booth, often in places where nobody would really think to visit, like, near entryways or just like way out of the way, off of the beaten path. And it was really just kind of a shitty way of handling things, and Working Designs was ultimately driven to Sony, which hilariously is probably the reason the company is dead today, but also deprived us of the ability to see probably most of the Sakura Taisen games years beforehand. I mean, can you imagine a world where we got strategy dating simulators on the Sega Saturn before the sixth console generation came out? Can you imagine how different it would be? Like, how much more readily accepting we would have been of those sorts of things from companies like Nipponichi and whatnot today?
Yeah, I mean, these are... Sega had a chance to bring over games that could have probably started something, the niche market for these type of games back in the 90s, as opposed to something that's started by Atlas and Nipponichi, in the mid to late 2000s, which is almost the norm now, and people see these like all over the place, and they're like being commercially accepted and brought over practically by anyone that's willing to pick them up. We got, like I said, we got Atlas, we got Nipponichi. There's another one. Who's the guys that brought over the three the big Nintendo Wii games? X Games, I forget. Xseed. That's Xseed. Yeah, Xseed brought those games over. I mean, we got all these publishers now who are willing to pick up the slack from what Working Designs used to do, which is bring over the niche RPGs. And imagine now if Working Designs was still around and probably still working with Sega, because Sega did continue to make RPGs. They just never came out west.
Yeah, and this is going to start for a few years, a period where Japanese RPGs are being developed by Sega but not being ported, up until roughly about the midpoint of the PlayStation 2 era. And it gets weird for Sega for a few years. But it's interesting to me that, as you had noted, Stolar said, well, these aren't going to be popular, these aren't going to be anything, and fucking Final Fantasy VII destroyed everything expectation-wise. I mean, this is a game that, by the end of that console cycle, had moved more than 5 million units, and as of this point is close to around 11 to 12 million units. It is basically Square Enix's biggest success story at this point. It's one of the biggest franchises that Square had anything to do with developing, or franchise entries, I should say. And unfortunately, it also kind of caused Square to make a lot of bad decisions that ended up with them inevitably merging with Square Enix out of necessity. Because, I mean, the Spirits Within didn't happen on its own. But for a while, it was a really big deal, and it was an amazing thing for JRPGs in general. Unfortunately, outside of the Final Fantasy titles, a lot of companies didn't really manage to keep up sales-wise. So in some respects, Stolar was correct. It's just that there were enough success stories there to keep the genre going into kind of a renaissance on the PlayStation, whereas the N64 didn't really see too many entries, and
I think
Sega
it
started,
had 2.
yeah, and Sega started pairing off a bit, and the games that they did release were not big successes by any means.
For in regards to Sega's like last few RPGs as a console maker, I would have to say it's pretty much like it's pretty sad to be honest because they had some really great RPGs on the Dreamcast itself.
Yeah, and that actually brings us into the 6th console generation a bit, starting off with the one JRPG that they internally developed that made its way to the US that was a big deal and financially viable and high quality, and that's Skies of Arcadia.
It's a beautiful game, and even to this day, it holds up wonderfully.
It is, and it's to the point where even when it was apparent that the Dreamcast was on its way out, it was one of the very first games that Sega said, okay, we're going to salvage this, and they cleaned it up, put in extra content, and brought it out again on the GameCube. So maybe it's just that Sega makes bad decisions. I don't know. But
I definitely have to say it was a bad decision on their part. I mean, the game was originally planned to be released on both the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube, but for whatever reason, I guess there was an issue that I don't know what the problem was, but they canceled the port for the PlayStation 2 and made it practically a GameCube exclusive, which, at the same time, now that the Xbox is out, and, Sega is literally splitting up in 3, releasing games for all 3 systems, so you would think they would try and at least port the game to as many consoles as they can to get as big an audience as they could, but they stick to the least selling console of that generation.
yeah, and I feel like it's really interesting, too, because I never got the impression that Sega was particularly invested in trying to make games for the Xbox until the next generation. Like, you didn't really see Sega's best and brightest appearing on the Xbox in any capacity, which, small wonder, the games were not selling in Japan, obviously. But it's interesting because it seemed as though they invested a lot of their effort into the PlayStation 2 because they knew the PlayStation 2 was the de facto winner. But they kept giving these things to Nintendo for whatever reason, and it never struck me as particularly good business sense, and I think that probably hurt them as much as anything else, because Skies of Arcadia did have that opportunity, especially if they had ported it at the time that they did, to have still been a winner, because at that point, JRPGs were something that the market was hungry for and wasn't really getting a lot of, and if they did, it was really weird shit. Like, I can't even remember the name of it, but there was this, I want to say it was Otogi Demon King or something like that.
Otogi for the Xbox, yeah.
Okage Shadow King, there we go.
Okage, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah, that game was aesthetically interesting, but Jesus Christ, that was a piece of trash. And there was that. There was Ephemeral Fantasia, which, we should have known that Konami was a horrible fucking company years before when that game came out, because that game was a fucking hate crime.
Oh, yeah.
Jesus Christ. You want to talk about one of the worst JRPGs ever. That game used a Groundhog Day loop that was impossible to survive without a fucking strategy guide or weeks of plotting out people's individual activity. It was just so terrible. Oh, my God.
Yeah.
And Final Fantasy X was it. For a while, Final Fantasy X was it. And Sega had that opportunity again to get that money, and they put it to the GameCube, which was the third place entry in the console wars collectively.
Well, on the PS2, we did finally get a US release of Sakura Wars, So Long My Love.
Yeah, at the very, very, very,
End
very,
of the system.
very end of the system's life cycle, which I actually want to talk about a little later, because it has equivalent impact elsewhere. But outside of Skies of Arcadia, Sega doesn't really release any other JRPGs during this console cycle, like, at all. They
No.
released Shining games, but
They
they
did.
were all action RPGs that were not very good.
They did do the Sega Ages remakes of Phantasy Star 1 and 2, but they never got ported to the US.
Nope. There was a plan to do that. I don't remember the name of the developer, but they're dead now, so it doesn't matter. I promise you, they've released one game, and you probably don't own it. There was a company that was going to port all 3 of the planned Sega Ages Phantasy Star remakes in one collection to the PlayStation 2, and that would have been awesome. It was announced right after Phantasy Star Generations 2 came out in Japan, and everybody was just chomping at the bit to get this. Like, I pre-ordered this with my, at the time, local EB Games, hoping against hope that this thing would come out, and instead, Sega of Japan canceled Phantasy Star 4 in the Sega Ages lineup, and then that developer quietly went out of business. The closest that we got was a rebirth of the Phantasy Star series, which even then wasn't a traditional Japanese RPG. We got Phantasy Star Online. And I love Phantasy Star Online, don't get me wrong, but it's not Phantasy Star. Not
in the traditional sense.
Right, exactly. It isn't that sort of experience. And Sega just kind of, outside of the Sakura Taisen games that they were releasing in Japan, Sega just kind of quietly abandons the JRPG genre at this point for a few years, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because, again, on the PlayStation, the renaissance that we had seen of JRPGs for the PlayStation 2 had started to die off. You know, this was the time period where Working Designs actively ceases to exist as a company towards the end of the PlayStation 2 era.
Thanks in no part to Sony of America's policy towards game publishing.
Yeah, that was a big part of it, and a bunch of other companies were screwed over at that point. But in general, we just start seeing a lot less JRPGs during this cycle. Atlus still developed games, although they kind of got into some shit with Sony, to the point where Atlus of Japan decided to give Sony the biggest middle finger possible by releasing a Mega 10 game for the Xbox that never came to the US and was never going to, but essentially doing so as a way of saying, fuck you, we're not going to take your bullshit, which I think was a big part in how they eventually softened how they handled these sorts of things, because, you know, From Software had no say in what Age Tech could do as far as porting games, and Working Designs quietly died off. But Atlus at the time, you know, the Mega 10 franchise has never been a big hit here until Persona, but in Japan, it's probably the number 3 or number 4 JRPG franchise, pound for pound, so they have that kind of weight, at least in Japan, to say, hey, Sony, you remember how you didn't let us bring Innocent Sin over to the US because of Gay and Hitler? Fuck you, we're going to make games for the Xbox, just as a scare tactic, and it kind of worked, because we haven't heard about those stories so much post the PlayStation 2 era. But it's for the PlayStation 2 in general, there's a lot less JRPGs coming out, and the JRPGs that are coming out are generally higher budget productions. Outside of the ones that Working Designs had released, we're starting to see the, I guess you want to say, technologically inferior games, though I love me my sprite art, coming out for the DS, the Game Boy Advance, the PlayStation Portable, and we're not really seeing them on the consoles anymore. And the games that we are seeing on the PlayStation 2 are fewer and further between. There's still some success stories. You know, Xenosaga was a big deal. Final Fantasy X was a big deal. Final Fantasy 12 slightly less so. But by and large, it's the Renaissance has kind of ended, and the only things that are releasing at this point are the ones that are likely to make shitloads of money.
It was also kind of a transitional phase going on for the way RPGs were. They were more people at that time were transitioning from like traditional JRPGs to more of the action-oriented RPGs.
That is true.
I mean, you had a whole bunch of, you know, these games that were being put out by, well, you had like the Baldur's Gate franchise, and the games just like that. You know, the action RPG ones like Summoner, Fable, Morrowind, all these, you know, third-person, over-the-shoulder, first-person type of games, and people were starting to go more towards those, and because they were more accessible, something you could pick up and put down. as opposed to like the RPGs that we're more traditionally familiar with.
Yeah, Japanese RPGs took a really long time to evolve, and honestly, they still haven't evolved to the point where they need to. But this is also the console generation where the Western RPG starts coming more to the forefront as well. Games like Diablo had flirted with console relevance, but it wasn't until the seventh console generation where we started seeing games like Morrowind, Summoner, other Western developed games start appearing on these consoles, The Bard's Tale as another example, and starting to capture some of that marketplace from people who maybe wanted to play an RPG but didn't necessarily want to wait all of that time since the JRPGs were dwindling and didn't necessarily want to deal with the rigid restrictions that JRPGs utilized. So here is where we start seeing, at least in the US, the power balance kind of shift, and Western RPGs are starting to pick up steam. Or excuse me, the sixth console generation is where we start seeing that kind of shift a bit. But then in the seventh console generation is where everything kind of comes to a head. Sega releases one distinct JRPG of note themselves during this period, which is Valkyria Chronicles, a game that was considered to be a huge success story for Sega because they managed to get it to a point where it sold 1 million units through grassroots advertising. And, word of mouth got that game to where it was. We also saw NIS bring out what was at that point and still kind of is to this day the only Sakura Wars title at all for both the PlayStation 2 at the tail end of the sixth console generation and the Wii as an introductory point to the seventh console generation. And at that point, basically, it's the last game to have been brought over, as no other companies really want to touch allowing these games on their consoles for some shit-awful reason.
I heard it was mostly because of poor sales. They were originally planning to do like a PSP port of the first 4 games, for the PSP, like all 4 games, and that got axed because it just didn't sell well on the PS2. And I think it was Xseed who was originally planning to bring them over.
If it was poor sales, it wasn't because of anything to do with Nippon Ichi. Well, Xseed might have been considering it, but Nippon Ichi actively went back to Sony and said, hey, can we bring these games out on the PSP or whatever since they exist? And Sony said, nah. And at that point, they said, well, shit, what the fuck are we going to do now? And they gave up. If Xseed was planning to do something with it, like, that is a bit beyond what I've heard. It's possible. But Nippon Ichi never really had a negative stigma against the franchise for sales. Sony just told them to go fuck themselves, and they didn't have a lot of other options at that point. But it's outside of those 2 games, we don't really see anything JRPG related coming out of Sega during the 7th console generation to speak of. Outside of, re-releases of old games that are showing up on Sega Classics collections and whatnot. We see 2 more Valkyria Chronicles titles. One comes to the US on the PlayStation Portable, the other does not. And we see a small handful of action RPG type games maybe come out of them with a Phantasy Star online sort of esque derivative game for the the PlayStation Portable. But otherwise, Sega just kind of stops making JRPGs that make it to the US for a while at this point. Like, I want to say outside of Valkyria Chronicles 3, which we didn't even get, like, they kind of let that market dry up from their side of things. And meanwhile, in the 7th console generation, Square Enix continues to be Square Enix. This is the point where we actively get Final Fantasy XIII after multiple delays, and it makes its money, but people actively become critical of it. This is also the point where we just start seeing JRPGs kind of drying up in general, which is weird. Like, the very tail end of the 6th console generation saw Persona 3 and Persona 4 come out and make a certain amount of money for Atlas, and then we see nothing from them outside of Catherine for the entire 7th console generation, all the way up until the announcement of Persona 5. Like, literally nothing. We saw a couple of side story type games released, like fighting games and dancing games, but we have mostly seen the games that they've released come out on the handhelds. They released nothing during, like, nothing for the consoles during that time period that was, relevant to the Mega 10 franchise. It's just a lot of drying up of the JRPG market in general, with a couple of the big dogs consistently releasing something. But otherwise, it's we've just been seeing a lot less of them all the way until the tail end.
It could be possible that even though Sega kept trying to attempt to release, traditional JRPGs and strategy RPGs, that they may have caught wind of, like, how the trend was going with, JRPGs in America at least, and has jumped the bandwagon ahead of time because, I mean, literally all we had the last two RPGs, Sakura Wars and what was that other game? I forget now.
Valkyria Chronicles.
Valkyrian Chronicles. They released, those three games, and then all of a sudden it's just like we don't see nothing from them ever again. In fact, it's mostly now like the whole market of RPGs is action adventure oriented, third person adventure, sandbox type RPGs. It's that's pretty much all we're seeing right there because people want RPGs that are more accessible, and it's definitely hurt the market in terms of creativity.
Yeah, and it was that way for a number of years, honestly. Like, and you can see it in basically any fandom. Nintendo originally started porting over the Fire Emblem games during the Game Boy Advance era, and released a small handful of them to the Game Boy Advance, and then I think one to the GameCube and one to the Wii, and just really showed a distinct lack of interest in doing anything with the genre. Square Enix starts diversifying at this point. They buy into IDOS and start working with IDOS more regularly as a publisher as it relates to games in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. The Enix side, of course, of Square Enix, tries to experiment with online games. Dragon Quest X never makes it to the U.S., despite being released for the PC, Wii, and Wii U.
Yeah, and a lot of the JRPGs that do come out during this time period are from lower band companies. A lot of the more, I don't even necessarily want to say AAA, because Sega hasn't really been a AAA publisher in a while, but a lot of the higher band companies start actively shying away from them. Like even Bandai Namco, known for the Tales series, starts kind of saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't bring over all of these Tales games. They're not making us money. They're not a big focal point, and they start kind of focusing on weird ports and games based on licensed properties instead of their own in-house stuff. The companies that are releasing these games are basically Xseed and Nipponichi for a while, and then eventually Idea Factory kind of expands out of Nipponichi and starts releasing their own games in the US exclusively. And these are all really niche products that aren't big sellers, but they're doing okay for these companies. So it's we've all of a sudden got these companies that are just opening up their own branches in the US to do what Working Designs wasn't doing anymore. Because again, Nipponichi is a division of Nipponichi Japan. Idea Factory, obviously a division of Idea Factory, and Xseed is a division of Marvelous. And they all start porting their own games to the US marketplace. And I don't want to leave out Axis here either, although their existence predominantly revolves around porting anything that Arc System Works makes, let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, outside of these like niche publishers, the market kind of dries up for a bit. Until about 2 years ago. Bandai Namco has kind of a revelation, and they realize, shit, why don't we just start bringing out these games and see if people will pay money for them? And all of a sudden, in rapid succession, we start seeing Sword Art Online games. We start seeing games based on something other than Naruto and Dragon Ball Z. They fucking brought out a Saint Seiya game, for Christ's sake. And they start just saying, well, we're just going to release every Tales game. Fuck it. Let's see what happens. Meanwhile, Sega buys Atlas. And suddenly, they've got one of the major JRPG developers in their pocket okay, let's see what we can do with that. And they just start kind of relying on Atlas a bit for that. So they decide, you know what? Let's re-release Valkyria Chronicles. Let's start making the games that the fan base wants and see what happens. And they're already talking about re-releasing Valkyria Chronicles 3 in the US, which they never did. On top of them bringing out Seventh Dragon 3 on the 3DS just this year. And it's none of these games are big success stories in any case, but it shows a sign to at least give that another shot. So maybe they've got another opportunity to release something. But it's just very weird to realize that during all of these periods where these games were at their peaks, Sega never had a big seller, to the point where when these things started winding down, Sega said, fuck it, and just stopped making them.
That's a shame, too, to be truthfully honest, because despite the fact that, some of the games weren't big sellers, like Skies of Arcadia has potential that if they were to re-release that game right now, and on multiple platforms, I guarantee you that would probably finally hit 1 million sales. I believe the initial Dreamcast sales were somewhere just above 500,000.
Yeah, and I feel like looking at these things, though, you can start to see like a few basic patterns as to why these games never took off. Part of it obviously has to do with them being entirely on Sega consoles. And while the Genesis was competitive with the Super Nintendo, the Dreamcast struggled to make 10 million units and ultimately didn't. The Saturn was a colossal failure in all possible respects and outside of Japan, and even then it wasn't any great shakes. And the Master System was just not able to compete with the NES because nothing could have.
A little too late to the party as well.
Yeah, you have all these different consoles that were just always never best in show. Even the Genesis was competitive for a couple of years, but they still ended up losing. And it's important to note that, second place may just still be the first loser, but you can still make some money from that. And Sega was never in a position to even try in a lot of cases, because the Master System was just kind of a DOA console in a lot of respects. The Dreamcast was severely screwed right from jump, and everybody kind of knew it.
Yeah, the moment they announced the PS2, it was just game over.
Mm-hmm. And you can't really expect any kind of great success stories from Phantasy Star. You can't really expect any kind of great success stories from the Dreamcast release of Skies of Arcadia. But it's clear that up until the point where Sega became their own private developer and started releasing games on the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, the GameCube, that they were never in a position where they could have drawn Final Fantasy VII money, because they were never in a position where they had the installed user base to try and do that. But I feel like it's also kind of worth noting that, as we've discussed a couple of times, Sega was just really bad at making decisions, just in general.
Marketing, for the Genesis era, they did a decent job marketing, but they marketed towards a specific audience. Like I said, the RPGs are pretty much a little bit more difficult to market when you're pretty much sitting here trying to make the Genesis or Mega Drive out to be like this edgy, hardcore system that's just too cool for people who want to sit there and play the Nintendo. How do you market like the Shining Force series, a game that literally is rather slow and takes time to grind, as well as the Phantasy Star games, and then you want to sit there and you want to try and convince these people to somehow and buy a Sega CD to play these other amazing games that are on there, RPGs, and then all of a sudden you got that colossal failure of the Saturn. Pretty much every generation has a good story as to why RPGs from Sega just don't take off. For, like I said, it's mostly marketing, and I guess at the same time the aesthetics of the games just seemed a little too complicated. Whereas you look at Phantasy Star, you look at the names of these spells and the items and stuff like that, and it does not seem familiar to somebody who's traditionally played, Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy, where the spells are got simple names like Hurt, Heal More, or Fire. As opposed to something like Fira or Giga or Watt or a Monomate, for that matter.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of aesthetic complaints that you could make about the games. I would also probably say, in a lot of respects, that it kind of comes down to overall marketing, Because, I mean, even if Nintendo was not big into RPGs of any capacity, when they decided they wanted to make their own JRPG in the US marketplace, you knew about it. Because for months, there were advertisements that said, point blank, this game stinks, and talked about, like, what else? Earthbound, and just how great an experience it was. And even if you didn't buy Earthbound, you knew what Earthbound was because they were buying full page advertisements fucking everywhere and showing that game like it was the second coming of Christ to get you interested in buying it.
And to this
Whereas,
day, I still remember one of the weirdest advertisements for it. It was a scratch off that had a specific thing for you to smell. That is some weird but extremely effective marketing.
right, and by Sega's comparison, you know, if you were not a Sega fan, you didn't know shit about Fatal Labyrinth or Phantasy Star 3 or the Game Gear versions of the Shining Force games or whatever. Like, these were not games that Sega put a shitload of time and effort into marketing in any capacity. You definitely didn't see anything on TV about any of their JRPGs, literally ever. And that actually became a thing that after Final Fantasy VII, we started seeing on TV constantly. Final Fantasy VIII, granted, was kind of marketed as an action game, which, fuck you, but it had huge television marketing. That was a big fucking deal. And Sega never did that with any of their JRPGs. They never tried to sell you on Shining the Holy Ark or Shining Force 3 on television. They didn't try to sell very much of anything on television during the Saturn era, but especially not the JRPGs. These games have always been kind of like third tier in a lot of respects, and like Sega just kind of expected, well, we'll port these games, which are almost certainly way harder for us to translate than a Sonic the Hedgehog or whatever, and we'll see if people buy them. When you would think with the amount of money and time that would be invested into translating these games, the smartest thing would have been to market the hell out of them.
Yeah, and the marketing part of it just wasn't there. I mean, if you look at the 90s, I mean, Sega did everything they could to just pretty much they pretty much made their ads to attack Nintendo directly. It wasn't so much about the games. It was just like 30-second video, small clips of the game. You never saw a single RPG in any one of those clips or montages or commercials because just Sega just wanted to be seen a certain way. And these games, like the RPGs, like Phantasy Star 4 being their biggest one that they've ever developed for the console, cost a lot of money when it came out as well. It just didn't seem like they had any priority in terms of wanting to get people to latch on to this game of theirs that took them so long to develop and took them even just as long to port it to translate it and bring it to the U.S.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting, too, because Sega's kind of sort of picking up the idea of, hey, let's re-release Valkyria Chronicles. Hey, let's re-release Valkyria Chronicles 3. Hey, let's port 7th Dragon. And they're kind of at a point now where they don't need to do any of that because they've got Atlas on board, and Atlas can kind of just be their RPG wing in a lot of respects.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that we're kind of seeing Sega come back around on these concepts now when they just don't really need to, because there's not a particularly compelling reason for them to do it. Like, there's not a good reason for them to say, well, you know, let's try to do this, or let's try to do that, and let's try to make, you know, this game popular, and let's try to make that game popular, and whatever, because there's just no real onus on them to try and make something that, in a lot of respects, is in a competing marketplace for attention with the games that they have that Atlas is making. So I kind of wonder if maybe that's just not going to be a thing that we're even going to see out of them at this point. Like, maybe they're just going to try and release the old games that they've released and just call it a day. But it's interesting that after years and years of just kind of not doing anything with the genre, that we're suddenly starting to see kind of an uptick in their recognizable behavior on it, when we haven't seen anything come out of them since, again, Valkyria Chronicles 2, for the most part. I mean, like, maybe it's possible that they can try and release another top shelf game, or that they can try to release a game that is instantly recognizable as being the big hot thing. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's certainly possible. But it's just kind of interesting that we're at this point where Sega's giving it another kick at the can, metaphorically speaking, when JRPGs were kind of a niche product for a number of years.
Yeah, niche. In terms of RPGs just being a niche, I mean, it looks like it just went back to that category. I mean, we have all those Atlas and Nippon Ichi games, the X-Seed games. I mean, it's not so much like, Square Enix is really doing much in this day and age. It seems like they've even veered completely off course from even making what you could even consider a traditional RPG. I mean, we have so many different types of games. I mean, look at some of the games that we've been playing lately. I mean, most of them are niche-based anime RPGs. Some of which I think, like those idle RPGs that you've been playing on your stream lately, they were very interesting, and they're more traditional to RPGs. There's the Atelier series, which is being brought over by Tecmo Koei. Sega just, and they have, like you said, they have Atlas at their side. So if anything, they should really concentrate on just maybe getting Atlas to be their workhorse for the RPG front. But we are still seeing a complete change in Sega's attitude. I mean, they're making the effort to try and win back their fans, as we've been seeing with all these polls they've been making, asking like their fans, like, okay, what is it you missed? What is it you want us to concentrate on? They're showing a little bit of this effort with the new Sonic games that they're trying to put out. So. And on top of that, if you look at their catalogs that they've been re-releasing constantly, they have the entire Phantasy Star and Shining Force franchise available on Xbox Live Arcade, on PlayStation Network, on Steam, on GOG. So it's possible that if these games do sell enough and they pay attention to the numbers, they might, because right there they just built up an audience, because now they have all these games that were only regulated to one freaking console per console generation, and now they have a much bigger, broader audience. And I'm seeing more people talking about these games now than I did years ago. So it's definitely possible that Sega may jump back into the JRPG genre, whether it's with Atlas or by themselves. So it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know. It seems like they maybe have a chance to try to do that again. Maybe like give it another shot insofar as being successful in this particular domain is concerned. I feel like it's interesting that they would even make the attempt, but it's just kind of amusing to me that we're at a point where Sega now more than anybody could actively make that effort to try and become that JRPG publisher that they seemed to want to be for years. And now they're kind of at a point where they don't even need to. And the only thing that comes to my mind is I kind of wonder just how long they can go without screwing it up in some capacity or another. But like looking back on it, it's kind of apparent that it mostly comes down to Sega is just not very good at making decisions and marketing their games and keeping their allies close and just anything really at all. So it's probably not as confounding as you would think when you actually look at it all in one big scope. It's just, hopefully Sega doesn't blow themselves up in the next year or so and actually does what needs to be done here. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. At this point, I'm holding out for a Skies of Arcadia HD edition release on Steam. Sega, if you're listening, that would be the smartest move you can do right now.
Yeah, and I think we've probably about wrapped it up as far as where we can go with this particular topic. But I think we've kind of pinned it down here, and hopefully it won't stay that way forever. But I just want to say thank you very much, Mr. Hubbs, for coming in for a podcast this time around. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I had a lot of fun.
Well, not a problem. You are welcome back anytime. But on that note, join us next week when our topic will be, why are there all of these bees in my teeth? On behalf of Robert Hubbs, this is Mark B. saying thank you very much for listening and stay safe out there, Junkers.